with multifamily, with industrial. As far as making it equitable beyond that, there are new classifications. I think of well as one of them. So beyond just building green, there are new standards that buildings can meet to provide additional benefits to their employees, to increase diversity, and so more investors are starting to think in those terms as well, beyond just the design.
I would argue that I think the investors are finally getting there, but as Bruce alluded to, this doesn't necessarily have to be rocket science, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that has been done and is being done successfully in cities all across this country. You don't have to go international. There are cities that have adopted mixed income for 40 years. It's not a new concept. And it can be an economically viable one as well. And it don't have to be hard. And one of the things we see from a planning standpoint is that the viability of those households, if you have households that are at 80% of AMI, 60% of AMI, that make up 25% of your building, it actually leads to a turnover in income in those households when they're mixed in the same school districts and the same eating opportunities as other places. And so there are economic dominoes that fall when you're able to diversify your households. And you know, the Urban Land Institute is having their fall conference, I believe it's next week. And it is my understanding that they're finally beginning to have some equity conversations. But I think the makeup sometimes of the population doesn't necessarily lend well to that equity conversation. And so that's a much longer conversation I'll have over drinks later, but that's something that we should address as well.
And as density increases in Houston, the prospect of just simply smaller market rate units becomes more viable as well, I think. That's another way you could address affordability.
Design, affordability by design.
By design.
So there, as a rule of thumb. Another, I like to go back to the green discussion. Okay, so let's talk about, you always have to define sustainability. It's like that's where you usually start. So what's green? Green means you're conserving. Sustainability means that you are repairing sometimes. You're starting to think about how you're looking at a sustainable future, but it's not typically a strategy just at a regional scale that understands that you're in a certain place, right? We're table flat with our clay soils, and we always lived in a place where water went very slow. And we've done everything we can to make water go very what? Fast, right? And so, so in a regenerative model, you think about it from this perspective. We talked about the flooding piece of it, and the city and county working together. The city just worries about their pipes being overwhelmed, and the county is guessing how much water is coming at them next year from a city that doesn't plan. Okay? It's just sort of a simple way of putting it. But what if we looked at different parts of our city and region and said, what if they performed at the same quality in terms of slowing down water as coastal prairie? Right? And just think about something at that level. Now that would change quite a bit. But what would that require besides the plan? You'd have to have, if you look at our communities, who are the landholders? Parks, rec and parks, school district, other special agencies, flood control district. So can you imagine those special districts in the same room working on a smart detention strategy? I think those boards would have a meltdown, but, and this time over flooding.
Yeah.
And so, but we have the capacity, we have, just applying best practice, we can do all this. It's just a willingness.
One group that we have not talked about at all, and I'm surprised we haven't broached it, is TechStat, but we'll get there. We'll get there. A short question. I have heard lead experts say that high lead ratings actually don't always yield lower carbon emissions or lower energy consumption. Is that true?
Lower to what? Compared to what?
Just lowered.
Well, it's, I would think, if you're looking at, I think there's a baseline question, right? That's the, and so comparing it to what piece of it? So I master planned the UC Merced campus. It's a triple net zero campus. They had a baseline of buildings of from the Cal State system and the UC system, you had a gazillion million square feet of baseline we could work against. So tell us about baseline, what that
Well,
means.
essentially, yeah, baselines is, in the code, is just a generic term for a building that doesn't have that much glass, that has a lot of insulation, and has efficient lighting and efficient HVAC systems. So, but we usually tend to compare against that. Let me give you an example that happened in New York a few years back. There is an Empire State Building and there is a new Bank of America building. And after New York, I actually started collecting data and publishing data on the energy use of buildings. Turned out that the Bank of America, which was a LEED Platinum building, was using a lot more energy per square foot than the Empire State Building. You would look at both buildings and you would say, well, obviously, the Bank of America building was a fully curtain wall glass building. Glass is more conductive than opaque surfaces. So you were using, obviously, more energy there than the Empire State Building that was opaque facade with punch holes on it. What happened was that, so I guess to my point, the Empire State Building is closer to a baseline condition, right? Quote unquote. It's an older building as well, so it has been retrofitted, so it has other things. But what happened also was that the Bank of America wasn't, I understand, wasn't commissioned right. And David, hello. David McLean is building commissioner.
I didn't do it.
Put you out there,
Right. But David is a commissioning agent, and essentially that's an important part of your piece when you're building with LEED. LEED requires that your buildings are commissioned, which means that all your systems are working right. And that's what happened with the Bank of America. They came back and they actually fine-tuned all the systems to make it work right.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So Alfonso is going to kill me for saying this after, but
Well, kill's a strong word.
that's a strong word.
I will strangle you.
A lot of what the construction industry has learned from LEED certification and Energy Star has become somewhat standard practice in new construction. For the ULI Texas Forum, we toured the Springdale General facility, which is mostly nonprofit tenants in East Austin. And what the developer told us was that they chose not to do LEED certification because for them it was costly and they wanted to pass those savings along to their nonprofit tenants. Now I agree with what Alfonso said, that if you don't get it certified from a special third-party board, there's no way of knowing if you actually achieved those goals. But there is an element of the gap is growing between people who are building green and getting certified green. I think the overall trend is that this is a good thing, because if you're incorporating as a standard more green construction methods, that's good for the environment. But if we don't have a way to certify it, it's hard to know that we're achieving those goals.
I'm gonna leave that alone, but okay. What opportunities exist for converting existing buildings to LEED, and who is doing this, if anyone?
Yeah, I'll answer this real quick. So I mentioned retail is a big opportunity. So some of you probably saw that Brookfield acquired General Growth Properties, the largest mall owner in America, end of last year for like $27 billion. It was seen as a big contrarian play. You know, malls have faced a lot of challenges with big box store closures, with e-commerce, and so people ask, well, why is Brookfield buying all of these outdated malls? Price was certainly part of that, but also there's been a big push to kind of city centerize all of these underutilized malls. So it was seen as a massive land play to tear down the Macy's, Sears, and JCPenney's of the world and build more mix of uses and density. And as Brookfield is the largest owner of LEED certified buildings in the United States, one could reasonably think that they would turn a lot of these malls into mixed use, potentially redevelop them as LEED. So I think that's a place where you might see some pretty positive trends with that.
Yeah, I think some of your easier examples are going to be on the retail side as well as your multifamily residential. We're starting to see that in other parts of the country, not as much here in Houston, but there are opportunities to take some of the older multifamily residential, some of the older real factory buildings, those kinds of things, and actually redevelop them for opportunities in a much more sustainable fashion.
Right.
And so there are examples across the country where that's being done successfully, and I think there's some reasons and opportunities to be doing that more here in Houston.
And that's a WeWork model as well. WeWork actually, they aim to occupy historical buildings. That's in their description.
Which leads to the next one. How is the city or other conveners reaching out to businesses to collaborate on strategies to reduce miles of transportation, encouraging remote work, etc.? For example, shared hubs, tech spaces where people can work closer to home part-time. And WeWork is one of the best models that I know of. There are others?
Industrious.
Mm-hmm.
Internally, a lot of the large tenants, we've seen that the office sector faces real threats to the business model because some of the biggest tenants downtown, Bank of America and others, they reduced their footprint collectively on average 30 to 40%, and they moved from older generation buildings into brand new buildings, so you see the flight to quality. But with that, there's more open floor plans, more hoteling. Companies are letting people work at home on Fridays or every other Friday, and so I think it's coming internally from the tenant side. They're allowing people to work at home.
And be more efficient with spaces, which leads also to smaller spaces and paying less for energy just because you have a more smaller spaces. We Gensler are moving to a new space, and we're gonna be fully agile, which means that most of us, with you too, all of us are assigned a laptop, and we can work from essentially the office or anywhere in the world. So as long as we are connected.
Just don't bring a house plant.
Yeah, yeah, essentially.
And the same thing, I think what the technology has allowed us to do is be that much more nimble, right?
Yes.
Our firm does the exact same thing, and we use everything on smartboards. And so we, oftentimes, we're connected through all of the various platforms that allow you to share technologies. So we have some people in the office in a conference room, and we have some people in their living room, quite frankly. As long as they're clothed appropriately, it works very well. So that's something.
Well, you don't have to turn the camera on.
You have to turn the camera. As impressive, and many of us know that the Houston leadership, USGBC's chapter, and those kinds of things are very strong here. However, it does seem as the Houston commercial real estate industry is pushing hard against requiring business owners to track energy usage. Has that been what you guys have seen?
Yes.
And how can we change that?
I don't know. Because a lot of companies actually don't want to disclose those numbers. They're kind of proprietary, so yeah.
I don't know if we mentioned this before, but Mayor Turner, he's the vice chair of the 60 mayors that have committed to uphold the Paris Accords. Yeah, there has been this big push, and I don't know what the answer is, because without that data to track, it's going to be very hard to reduce the emissions from the buildings. You're not, in my humble opinion, you're not, filling the total CSR goal if you just build a building and don't track its performance.
Yeah. However, you need to share that data with GBCI whenever you're submitting for leads, so that data does exist.
We could also work at a district scale for some of this, so that CenterPoint can tell us what's coming out of meters at a district scale or block scale, without being property specific. That would help us understand where some of our policies or strategies would be most useful regarding our energy strategies for this. There's in an area that floods and is prone to hurricanes, that thinking differently about the grid and utilities is something we probably should be doing. And so to be much more focused on microgrids, and because modularity of your system is like besides the redundancy and feedback loop stuff, a modular redundant system is more resilient, because you can lose part of it without losing all of it, and so, and microgrids need a reliable demand, you can provide that, and a reliable supply.
If you need an analogy, Miami, some of you may have seen this, Miami recently started experiencing what's called sunny day flooding. So, meaning they're having days where they're getting flooding without any rain, simply due to its location relative to sea level rise. So Miami has invested a ton of money. There is a lot of valuable property in South Florida, as we know. So they are taking very active steps to shore up their shoreline. As well, they have pretty porous geology. That's another issue. But they're doing as much as they can.
But they're also another state where climate change doesn't exist. So we
Miami, it does apparently.
Yeah, you're gonna have to dart me. No, but there's that piece of it. What motivates us, and what's our value sets regarding that as a community?
Well, that goes back to where I was going to go, and I appreciate you actually did bring it up, Ruth. I want you to talk more about it. But how can the city encourage the creation of green natural areas to help mitigate this flooding? What can we do specifically? You touched on it briefly, but expand a bit.
There's most places have conditionally build and no build zones, right? And they're quite deliberate about that. I did a survey 5 years ago of all the cities in the United States that had completed and adopted climate action plans. And there's some strategies that end up being quite regional. So in the Midwest cities are really focusing on the no build as regards to their wetlands and rivers and lakes. They're a region that was really paying attention to that, and I thought, why not Houston? And so part of it, is how you define sustainability and how you think about where you build or where you conditionally build. So we've dealt with it in a regional scale with the Ike Dike and the Mid-Bay solution, right? So now, these are called wicked problems, where you solve one problem and you create 3 new ones, right?
Yeah.
These are all wicked problems. And so what does this region look like if we don't have any storm surge in it for 100 years? The soil will be different, the fauna will be different, the bugs will be different, and we're on 2 flyways, all right? And so unintended consequences for this, because we just want to protect property. Yeah. So sustainability, you have to stand back of this and really take a holistic view of this. And so my private sector clients I've had over the years, I'll generally say they're blue chip clients, and they are generous, they are community oriented, they build they think about building communities and not building buildings. They have a very different outlook on this. And they work in premium markets. And they see that all that is being connected. And so when we stand back and look at some of these larger issues and the types of decisions we're making, they're way more connected than we may think. And without honest dialogue with all of us about that, and really understand, bring all of our expertise to the table, this is the smartest room in town right now.
Yeah. That's a very good point. And that got me thinking about the environment. If you don't have that natural flooding for 100 years, how that might impact. However, I would weigh that against the downside risk to the Houston Ship Channel flooding with storm surge.
Yeah, that's different, and that's not what the motivation is for everything else.
But you also have Buffalo Bayou and Buffalo Bayou Park that actually allows flooding. It's part of the design. Yeah, granted, during Harvey it actually flooded a little too much, but it came back. It came back as it was.
Yeah,
so yeah.
I'm going to pivot. We're going to have a fun question. I know the answer. I want to let you guys address it. Is there anything in the code about adding showers to buildings? The Bayou Ground Greenways 2020 project and bike plan is working on people biking to work. But if you've tried to bike to work, you're off sweating.
I hear you, brother or sister who wrote that. I hear you. Usually it's the owner, the one who installs the bike room and the shower or showers.
Is there anything in the code that says they should or have to?
Not codes.
Not that I know
Lead,
of.
yes.
It's a lead thing, but it's not not in the code.
It's not, so yeah, so the short answer is there's nothing in the code that says you have to. So let's be very clear. So if you're in a building and you got a bike and it's a nice expensive $2,000 bike and you bike in and there's no shower, that's because they didn't have to do it. So, you know, sucks to be you. But, you know,
it's LEED
now,
certified
as far
building,
as,
yes.
if it's LEED
And
certified,
you're looking for that.
certified,